Daniel Brooks dropped to his knees right there in the middle of the dusty main street of Harlan's Crossing, Arizona territory, and pressed his last biscuit wrapped in brown cloth still warm from morning into the hands of a tiny boy sitting alone against a broken hitching post. No hesitation, no thinking it through. His stomach had been growling since dawn. He hadn't eaten since yesterday, but the child's lips were cracked white, and his eyes held something no 5-year-old should ever carry: the quiet, exhausted acceptance of someone who had already stopped believing anyone would stop. If this story moves something in your chest, please subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss a single part. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happens next inside that courtroom will break your heart wide open. The summer of 1883 came down on Harlan's Crossing like a punishment from God. It had not rained in 31 days. The creek that ran behind the livery stable had shrunk to a muddy trickle. The cottonwood trees along the main road stood perfectly still in the dead air, their leaves gone pale and curled at the edges, as though even the trees had given up arguing with the heat. Dust settled on everything: the storefronts, the wagon wheels, the shoulders of men moving fast with their eyes down, trying to get their business done and get back somewhere cool before the afternoon sun turned the whole territory into a furnace. Nobody was standing still on the main street of Harlan's Crossing that July morning. Nobody except Daniel Brooks and the boy. Daniel had been working the road crew since before sunrise, hauling gravel and swinging a pickaxe on the stretch of trail west of town that the county commissioner had been promising to grade for 2 years. 12 hours of work for 35 cents and the promise of another day's wages if he showed up again tomorrow. His back ached down to the bone. His hands were so calloused they didn't blister anymore, just cracked and bled when the handle twisted wrong. He had one cloth-wrapped biscuit in his coat pocket and a half-full canteen on his belt, and he had been telling himself all morning that he would eat when he got to the shade of the mercantile awning. He almost made it. He was 3 steps past the broken hitching post outside Dunner's Feed and Seed when something made him stop. Not a sound. The boy wasn't making any sound at all. That was the thing that stopped him. Daniel turned around slowly, the way a man does when something tugs at the back of his neck and he can't explain it. And there he was, a small child no more than 5 years old, sitting in the dirt against the post with one leg stretched out in front of him at an angle that wasn't right. An oversized crutch lay beside him in the dust too long for his little arms. His shirt was too big. His trousers were stiff with dried mud. His lips were cracked and pale, and his dark eyes were moving slowly across the faces of the people walking past him. Not with desperation, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet observation, like a child who had spent enough time being invisible that he had stopped expecting anything different. Nobody was looking at him. A woman in a green dress stepped around him without breaking stride. 2 merchants arguing about lumber prices walked by him so close they nearly kicked his crutch. A man on horseback didn't even glance down. Daniel stood there for 10 full seconds. Then he walked back. He crouched down in the dirt in front of the boy, ignoring the heat radiating up from the ground, and looked at him straight on. "Hey there, son," he said quietly. "You all right?" The boy blinked, like the word son was something that needed a moment to travel. "I'm all right," the child said. His voice was very small and very careful, the way children get when they've learned that honesty sometimes makes adults uncomfortable. Daniel looked at the cracked lips, at the way the boy's small chest was working a little harder than it should be in the heat, at the canteen-shaped emptiness of the space around him. No food, no water, nothing. "When'd you last eat something?" Daniel asked. The boy was quiet for a moment. He looked down at his twisted leg, then back up. "I'm trying not to be hungry anymore," he whispered. Daniel Brooks had not cried since the night he buried his daughter 6 years prior. He had made himself a promise about that, and he had kept it through things that would have broken lesser men. But something in those 7 words, not "I'm hungry," not "I need help," but "I'm trying not to be hungry anymore," as though the child had decided the most dignified response to starvation was to simply stop wanting, hit him somewhere behind the sternum, like a fist. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the biscuit. He unwrapped it slowly, set it in both of the boy's hands, and watched the child look at it for a moment, as though checking to make sure it was real before taking the smallest, most careful bite imaginable. "Take your time," Daniel said. "Ain't going anywhere." He uncapped his canteen and set it on the ground within easy reach. And then Daniel Brooks sat down in the dirt in the middle of the main street of Harlan's Crossing, Arizona Territory, in the full baking heat of a July afternoon, and he waited. 3 men walked past and looked at him like he'd lost his mind. A woman with a parasol said something sharp to her companion about the kind of people who lounged around public thoroughfares. Daniel didn't move. He just watched the boy eat slowly, methodically, in the careful way of someone who doesn't know when the next meal is coming and wants to make this one last. "What's your name?" Daniel asked when the boy was about halfway through the biscuit. "Ethan," the boy said. Then after a pause, with a formality that was heartbreaking in something so small, "Ethan Miller." "I'm Daniel." Ethan looked at him with those dark, measuring eyes. "You work on the road crew," he said. It wasn't a question. "How do you know that?" "Your hands." Ethan said it simply. "My mama said men who work roads have hands that look like that. She used to watch the road crew from where we slept." Daniel kept his voice very even. "Where do you sleep, Ethan?" The boy glanced toward the western end of town in the direction of the old freeway bridge, the stone trestle the railroad had abandoned 3 years back. "Under the bridge," he said. "But Mama's not there anymore." "Where is she?" Ethan took another careful bite of the biscuit, chewed it slowly and swallowed. "There were men with badges," he said. "They came in the night and made everybody leave. Mama told me to stay still and not cry, and she would come back." He paused. "That was 4 days ago." 4 days. Daniel didn't let his face change. He had learned long ago that when a child is holding himself together, you don't react in a way that tells him how bad it is. You stay level. You stay present. "So you've been sitting here," Daniel said. "Different places," Ethan said with a small dignity that was almost worse than crying. "I walked to where the church ladies give out bread on Tuesdays, but I couldn't carry the crutch and the bread at the same time, so I dropped it." He looked at his hands. "I didn't mean to drop it." "I know you didn't." "The bread, I mean. I tried to pick it up, but my leg—" He stopped, looked at his twisted leg again with an expression that was too old for his face. "I fell down." "Did anybody help you?" Ethan looked up at him quietly. It was a look that answered the question without words, and it was the look that Daniel would carry for the rest of his life. "Let me get you out of this heat," Daniel said. He dusted off his trousers and looked around the street until he spotted Mamie Coulthard's small diner on the corner, the one with the blue curtains in the window and the hand-lettered sign that read, "Hot Meals 10 cents." "You ever been in that place over there?" Ethan shook his head. "It's cool inside. They've got a fan." Daniel picked up the boy's crutch from the dirt and held it out to him. "Think you can make it that far?" Ethan took the crutch and got himself upright with a practiced efficiency that told Daniel he had been doing this alone for a long time. "I can make it," the boy said. They walked slowly together across the street, Daniel shortening his stride to match the boy's careful halting rhythm, and he pushed open the door to Mamie's diner and held it while Ethan went through. Inside, it was dim and cooler, with a ceiling fan turning slowly overhead, and the smell of coffee and cornbread coming from the kitchen. 3 tables were occupied. Mamie herself was behind the counter, a broad-shouldered woman of 60 with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen everything. And she looked up when they came in, took in Daniel, then looked at the small boy beside him, and her expression shifted into something careful and attentive. "2," Daniel said. "Whatever's cold to drink first." Mamie set 2 tin cups of cold water on the counter without a word and watched Ethan drink his down in long, steady swallows. Then she refilled it. "Sit anywhere," she said, and the warmth in her voice was directed specifically at the child. They took a table by the window, and Daniel ordered cornbread and beans for Ethan and a coffee for himself because the coffee was cheaper than the cornbread, and he'd already given away the last of his food money for the day. He sat across from the boy and watched him eat properly. now slower even than before, like the safety of being inside had given him permission to take his time. "Ethan," Daniel said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth, because I'm going to try to help you." "All right." The boy nodded. "Is there anybody else? Anybody looking after you while your mama's gone? Family or a neighbor, or anybody from the church?" Ethan thought about it seriously. "Uncle Richard," he said finally. "But Uncle Richard lives far away. Mama said Seattle is very far." "You have an uncle in Seattle. He's rich," Ethan said matter-of-factly, the way children state things. "Mama said he has a big house and went to a real school. She said we couldn't go there because Uncle Richard and her had a falling out." He looked at his cornbread. "I don't know what a falling out is exactly, but I think it means they stopped being kind to each other." "That's about right," Daniel said. "She said he probably doesn't know we needed help." Ethan looked up. "Do you think that's true, that people sometimes don't know somebody needs help?" Daniel thought about all the people who had walked past this child in the past 4 days. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I reckon that's true sometimes." Ethan seemed to accept this. He went back to eating. Mamie came by to refill Daniel's coffee, and she leaned down slightly and said low enough that only he could hear, "You figure out what's happening with that boy." "Working on it," Daniel said. She looked at Ethan for a moment, then back at Daniel. "Marshall Hicks comes by around 3, she said. "If you need him." "I might." Mamie straightened up and went back to her counter, and the ceiling fan turned slowly, and outside the window, the main street of Harlan's Crossing shimmered in the July heat, while Ethan Miller ate cornbread and beans at a clean table for the first time in 4 days, with a stranger sitting across from him, who had given up his lunch and pulled up a chair and refused to leave. It was around that time that Ben Pruitt walked in. Ben Pruitt was not a bad man exactly. He was the kind of man who believed himself to be a good one, which was sometimes more dangerous. He owned the dry goods store 2 doors down, served on the town council, and had a habit of inserting himself into situations he'd decided were his business. He spotted Daniel and the boy from across the room, took in the crutch leaning against the table, took in Daniel's road crew clothes, and walked over with his thumbs in his vest pockets. "That boy one of the camp kids?" Pruitt said without bothering to lower his voice. Daniel looked up at him calmly. "His name is Ethan. His mother's one of those drifters they cleared out from the trestle bridge," Pruitt said. He was looking at Ethan now in a way that made Daniel's jaw tighten. "Boy, where's your mama?" Ethan looked at him steadily. "I don't know, sir." "Well, he can't just sit in here," Pruitt said, turning back to Daniel. "Mamie runs a business." "Mamie invited us to sit," Daniel said. "So I reckon that's between me and Mamie." "It's a public concern when vagrant children are wandering." "He's not wandering," Daniel said. His voice stayed level, but there was something in it that made Pruitt stop. "He's sitting, he's eating, and I'm with him. So whatever concern you have is settled." Pruitt looked at him for a moment, then at the boy, then back at Daniel. Something in Daniel's eyes must have communicated that this was not a negotiation, because Pruitt made a sound in his throat and walked back to the counter to order his coffee and stood there with his back to them. Ethan watched the whole exchange without making a sound. When Pruitt had gone, he looked at Daniel. "People do that a lot," the boy said quietly. "Talk about me like I'm not sitting right there." "I noticed," Daniel said. "Does it bother you when people do that?" Daniel looked at him. "When they do it to you, yeah, Ethan, it bothers me." The boy seemed to consider this answer with great seriousness. Then he went back to his cornbread. Marshall Eli Hicks arrived at 3:15, just like Mamie had said. He was a lean man with a drooping gray mustache and boots that needed new heels. And he listened to Daniel's account of the situation without interrupting, watching Ethan with the quiet attention of a man who had seen enough of the world to know that the real tragedy was usually sitting right in front of you. "Margaret Miller," Hicks said slowly when Daniel told him the mother's name. "Callie's the one who brought them in from the sweep, I think. Let me check the ledger." He looked at Ethan. "Son, were you with your mama under the trestle bridge on the night of the 12th? "Yes, sir," Ethan said. "She all right? Before they moved her on?" Ethan nodded. She kissed my head. She said she'd be right back. Hicks stood up straighter and exchanged a glance with Daniel over the boy's head. I'll send a wire to the county, he said quietly. See if she turned up at the hospital in Tucson or the women's shelter in Benson. Might take a day or two to hear back. He paused. In the meantime, the boy needs to be somewhere. He stays with me, Daniel said. Hicks looked at him. You sure about that? Until we find his mother or figure something else out. Daniel kept his eyes level. He needs somewhere safe. I've got a room over Carver's stable. It ain't much, but it's clean and it's mine. Hicks was quiet for a moment. He looked at Ethan. He looked at Daniel. He was doing the kind of calculation that honest men do, weighing what the rules said against what the situation actually required. Finally, he pulled his mustache once and nodded. I'll come by tomorrow, he said. We'll see what the county says. You keep him fed, and you keep him out of trouble, and we'll figure the rest out. Yes, sir, Daniel said. Hicks put his hat back on and walked out. Mamie watched him go, then looked at Daniel, and there was something in her expression, a quiet, measuring respect, that she didn't put into words. Ethan had been listening to all of it. Now he looked at Daniel with those dark, careful eyes. You don't have to do that, the boy said. I know, Daniel said. You don't even know me. No, Daniel agreed. But I know you haven't eaten in 4 days, and I know your mama's missing, and I know that's too much for one small person to carry by himself. He leaned forward slightly, his forearms on the table. Where I come from, Ethan, that's enough reason. Ethan was quiet for the long time. The ceiling fan turned. Outside, a wagon rolled past on the dirt street, and somebody called out to somebody else, and the ordinary afternoon went on. Then the boy said very quietly, My leg doesn't work right, in case you didn't notice. I noticed. Some places won't take children with... He stopped, tried again. Some places say it's too much trouble. Daniel looked at him steadily. My place isn't some places. Another long pause. Ethan looked down at his hands, then up. My mama's going to come back, he said. It was said with the fierce practiced conviction of a child who has repeated this to himself in the dark many times against the weight of doubt. I believe she is, Daniel said, and he meant it. But until she does... Ethan started, and then his voice did something it hadn't done once in the whole afternoon. It cracked just slightly, just at the edge like a small sound escaping before he could close it off. He pressed his lips together hard. Daniel didn't make a sound, didn't move toward him, just waited. That was something people would come to understand about Daniel Brooks in the weeks and months that followed. He never pushed. He never crowded. He just stayed. He made himself a steady, patient, unmoving presence and let people come to him when they were ready, and he waited as long as it took. Ethan swallowed, lifted his chin, got control of himself with a dignity that Daniel would remember for the rest of his life. Until she does, the boy said carefully. Could I stay with you? Yes, Daniel said. You can stay with me. They walked out of Mamie's diner together. When the sun had dropped low enough to cut the heat by a few degrees, Ethan's crutch working steadily on the wooden boardwalk, Daniel matching his pace without comment. They passed Ben Pruitt's dry goods store. They passed 3 women in bonnets who stared. They passed a group of men outside the saloon who went quiet and watchful as Daniel walked by with the crippled boy at his side. Daniel didn't look at any of them. He looked straight ahead. And Ethan, walking beside him for the first time in 4 days without being alone, glanced once at the man's face to confirm what he'd already decided. And then he looked straight ahead too. The room above Carver's stable had 1 window, 2 cots and a wash basin, and it smelled like hay and saddle oil, and it was the safest place Ethan Miller had been in longer than he could remember. Daniel lit the lamp, pulled the second cot into the corner, and shook out the extra blanket he kept rolled at the foot of his own bed. Wash your hands and face first, he said, then sleep. Ethan did as he was told, slowly and carefully, like someone learning what instructions that weren't cruel felt like. He lowered himself onto the cot, arranged his bad leg, and lay back. Daniel sat on the edge of his own cot with his boots still on elbows on his knees, listening to the sound of the stable below and the night wind starting up outside. "Daniel," Ethan said from the darkness. "Yeah. How come you didn't just keep walking?" Daniel thought about this for a moment. Thought about the 12 hours of work, and the 35 cents, and the one biscuit, and the specific quality of silence that had made him turn around. "Because you weren't asking for anything," he said finally. "Everybody who's asking for something, people can walk past that. Tell themselves somebody else will handle it." He paused. "But you weren't asking. You were just sitting there trying to get through the day by yourself, and you were 5 years old, and that wasn't right." Silence from the other cot. "Is that why?" Ethan asked. "That's why," Daniel said. Another long silence. Then, so quietly, Daniel almost didn't hear it. "Nobody ever sat down with me before. In the street, I mean." Daniel didn't answer right away. He looked at the ceiling at the shadows the lamp threw across the rough beams. "They will now," he said at last. Ethan didn't say anything after that. His breathing evened out slowly, the way children's breathing does when the body finally decides it's safe to let go, and within 10 minutes he was asleep. Daniel sat in the half-dark for a long time with his boots on, listening to the boy breathe, and to the horses shifting in their stalls below, and he thought about his daughter's face, and he thought about 35 cents and one biscuit, and he thought about a child who had decided the most dignified response to being abandoned was to simply stop expecting anything. He thought about all the people who had walked past that broken hitching post. He thought about the specific, terrible ease of walking past. And he understood sitting in the dark above the stable, with the sound of a sleeping child filling the room, that he had not saved Ethan Miller today. He had simply been the first person to stop. Everything that came after all of it would turn on that single ordinary act. He just didn't know yet how much. Daniel was back on the road crew by 5 the next morning. He hadn't slept much. He'd lain on that cot in the dark, listening to Ethan breathe, half expecting the boy to wake up screaming from whatever 4 days alone on the streets of Harlan's Crossing had put inside him. But Ethan slept straight through until the rooster started, and when Daniel sat up and lit the lamp, the boy was already awake, lying on his back, staring at the ceiling with those quiet, watchful eyes. "You don't have to get up," Daniel said. "I know," Ethan said. And then, "But I don't want to be alone in here." So Daniel made him sit on the 3-legged stool outside Carver's stable in the early morning shade while he worked, and Ethan watched the horses with a concentration that looked almost like reverence. And neither of them said much, and that was all right. Mamie Coulthard came by at 7 with a tin pail covered in cloth. She set it on the ground next to Ethan without ceremony and said, "Corn mush and molasses. Don't make a fuss about it." Ethan looked up at her with those serious eyes. "Thank you, ma'am." Mamie looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Daniel. "Marshall Hicks got a wire back from Tucson," she said. "Woman matching Margaret Miller's description was brought into the county hospital 6 days ago. Heat stroke. She was unconscious when they found her. They didn't know her name." Daniel felt something cold move through him. He kept his hands steady on the harness he was working. "She alive? Far as they know." Mamie's voice was even careful. "They're trying to identify her. Hicks says it might be a few more days." Daniel nodded slowly. "Does he know?" Mamie asked with a small motion toward Ethan. "Not yet," Daniel said. Mamie looked at the boy again, small, straight-backed, eating corn mush, like it was a formal occasion, and something passed across her face that she didn't put into words. She turned and walked back toward the diner without another word. Daniel stood there for a moment with the harness in his hands. Then Ethan said, without looking up from his pail, "Was that about my mama?" Daniel put down the harness and walked over and crouched in front of him. "They found a woman in Tucson who might be her," he said. He kept his voice honest and level. "She's at a hospital there. She got sick in the heat, Ethan, but she's alive as far as they know." Ethan put the spoon down very carefully inside the pail. His jaw tightened. He stared at the ground between his feet. "She was trying to come back," he said. It wasn't a question. It was the thing he'd been holding on to for 4 days, and finding out it was true, and finding out she was in a hospital bed somewhere in Tucson, hit him at exactly the same time, and Daniel watched the boy absorb it, with a stillness that was harder to witness than tears would have been. She was trying to come back, Daniel confirmed. Ethan picked up his spoon, put it down again. His hands were shaking slightly. "Can I see her?" "I'm going to work on that," Daniel said. "You have my word." The boy nodded once, sharp and precise, the way someone nods when they are holding themselves together by force of will, and he picked up his spoon a second time and went back to eating, and Daniel stood and went back to the harness, and the morning went on. By noon, the story was already moving through Harlan's Crossing, the way stories move through small towns, fast, distorted, and unavoidable. 3 different versions were circulating before Daniel even got to the lunch break. In one version, he had found the boy in the alley behind the saloon. In another, Ethan had been wandering the streets for 2 weeks. In a third, the one that had apparently started with Ben Pruitt Daniel had taken the child in for reasons that deserved scrutiny. That third version was the one that reached him personally. He was sitting on the edge of the water trough during the break when Cale Marsh, one of the other road workers, a big man with a red beard and no particular malice in him, sat down and said, "Pruitt's been talking Daniel." "I figured," Daniel said. "Says you're not a fit person to have a child in your care." Cale rubbed the back of his neck. On account of what happened with Clara. The name sat in the air between them like a stone dropped in still water. Daniel's daughter. 8 years old. 6 years gone. Cale looked uncomfortable. "I ain't saying I believe him. I'm just telling you what's being said." "I appreciate it," Daniel said. His voice was flat and quiet, and Cale, who had known him for 2 years, recognized that flatness and didn't push further. What happened with Clara was not a secret in Harlan's Crossing because nothing was a secret in a town of 400 people. 6 years ago, in a different town, Daniel Brooks had come home from a cattle drive with a month's wages and a thirst he couldn't reason with, and he had put his daughter on the back of a horse and ridden for his brother's place in the dark because he thought he was sober enough and he was not. And the horse had spooked on a bad stretch of road, and Clara had fallen, and she had not gotten up. He had not had a drink since the morning of her funeral. He had not forgiven himself for a single hour of the 6 years that followed. And now, Ben Pruitt was taking that wound and pressing on it in public, because Ben Pruitt had decided that Daniel Brooks was a problem to be solved, and a child in his care was an opportunity to solve it. Daniel went back to work. He swung his pickaxe with the methodical fury of a man who was not allowing himself to think too hard about what was already in motion, and he worked until his shoulders screamed and the sun dropped below the ridge. And then he walked back to town and back to the stable, and found Ethan exactly where he'd left him, sitting on the 3-legged stool outside, watching the horses with Mamie's empty tin pail beside him. "Good day," Daniel asked. "Mr. Carver let me brush one of the horses," Ethan said. There was something in his voice that hadn't been there that morning, a small, careful warmth. "He said I had a good hand for it." "You probably do," Daniel said. "He also said some men came by asking about you." Daniel stopped. "What men?" "He didn't say their names." Ethan looked at him steadily. "He said they were asking how long you'd lived here and what kind of man you were. He told them you were steady and honest, and they should mind their own business." A pause. "Then he said some things I don't think I'm supposed to repeat." Despite everything, Daniel almost smiled. "Old Carver's all right." "He gave me a biscuit," Ethan said. Then lower, 2 actually. "I only ate 1. Daniel looked at him. "Why only 1? Ethan was quiet for a moment. "In case tomorrow there isn't any." Daniel sat down on the ground beside the stool, put his forearms on his knees, and looked at the boy in the fading light. "Ethan," he said carefully, "I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it all right. Not just listen, but actually hear it." Ethan turned to face him. "While you're with me," Daniel said, "there will be food tomorrow. I promise you that. I don't make promises I can't keep, and that one I can keep. You don't have to save anything. You don't have to count what you've got and divide it by the number of days. That's over. You understand me?" Ethan looked at him for a long moment. "What if something happens to you?" he said. The question was asked with a devastating practicality, the way children ask questions that adults spend their whole lives avoiding. "Then Mamie will feed you," Daniel said. "And Carver will look after you until somebody better comes along. You're not going back to sitting beside that hitching post, Ethan. That's done." Another long pause. The horses shifted. Somewhere in the street, a door opened and closed. "Okay," Ethan said quietly. "Okay." He ate both biscuits that night. The newspaper arrived 3 days later. Not Harlan's Crossing's own weekly sheet, the paper out of Tucson, the one that went to 3 counties. Somebody on the county reporter's desk had gotten hold of Hicks's wire, had talked to somebody at the hospital, had talked to somebody in town, and had put together a story that ran under the headline, "Crippled Boy Found Alone in Extreme Heat Missing Mother, Uncertain Future." Daniel read it at Mamie's counter with a coffee going cold beside him, and his expression didn't change much, but his hand tightened on the paper until the page creased. The story was not cruel. In some ways, that made it worse. It was sympathetic and detailed, and it named Ethan by name, and it named Daniel by name, and it described Daniel's situation. The road crew wages, the room above the stable, the criminal record that Pruitt had apparently been happy to provide to anyone who asked, with a fairness that nonetheless made everything sound very fragile and very temporary. "It's already on the telegraph lines to Phoenix," Mamie said without being asked. "I know," Daniel said. "And Seattle probably." He looked at her. "The uncle," she said simply. He hadn't thought about the uncle. He should have thought about the uncle. He put the paper down and drank his cold coffee, and thought about it now, and none of the thoughts were comfortable. Ethan was at Mamie's back table doing the sums she'd set him. She'd taken it upon herself to give him schoolwork in the mornings, a decision she'd made without discussing it with anyone, as was her way. And he looked up when he heard his name in whatever Daniel and Mamie were saying at the counter. But he couldn't make out the words, and he went back to his sums. Richard Miller arrived on the Thursday stage. Daniel was at the stable when he heard the stage come in, and he didn't know yet who was on it, and it didn't occur to him that the well-dressed man walking down the main street with a leather valise and the careful evaluating look of someone taking inventory was walking specifically toward him until the man stopped in front of Carver's stable and said, "I'm looking for Daniel Brooks." Daniel straightened up from the wheel he was greasing. The man was somewhere around 45, clean-shaved, with the kind of clothes that were expensive without being flashy, the clothes of a man who had money long enough that he'd stopped needing to announce it. His eyes were sharp and dark, and they were Ethan's eyes, Daniel realized with a start. The same shape, the same measuring quality. "I'm Daniel Brooks," he said. Richard Miller looked at him the way men look at each other when they're deciding whether to be civil or direct, and then he apparently chose direct. "I'm Ethan's uncle," he said. "I came as soon as I saw the paper. Where is he?" "He's at the diner down the street," Daniel said. "He's safe. He's been well taken care of." "I'm sure he has," Richard said. The politeness of it was careful, deliberate, and contained something underneath it that Daniel recognized as the controlled voice of a man who was very angry and was choosing not to show it yet. "You want to see him," Daniel said. "He's my nephew," Richard said. "My sister's child. Yes, I want to see him." Daniel pulled a rag from his belt and wiped his hands. "Then let's go see him," he said. They walked down the street together without speaking. Daniel was aware of the looks they were getting, the well-dressed stranger from Seattle and the road crew worker side by side, and he kept his eyes forward and his pace even. At the door of the diner he stopped. "Before we go in," he said, "I want to ask you something." Richard looked at him. "Where have you been?" Daniel said. It wasn't said with anger. It was said with the plain, direct curiosity of a man who genuinely wanted to understand. "Your sister and that boy were sleeping under a trestle bridge. She had to run from a marshal's sweep in the middle of the night, and she ended up in a hospital bed in Tucson with nobody knowing her name. Where have you been?" Richard Miller's jaw tightened. Something moved behind his eyes, something that looked to Daniel's surprise a great deal like guilt. "My sister and I had differences," he said carefully. "I imagine you did," Daniel said. "People usually do, But that boy in there survived 4 days alone in July heat on whatever bread he could drag himself to on one bad leg. He paused, one hand on the door. So I just wanted to make sure we both understood what we're walking into. This ain't about you and me. This is about him. Richard looked at him for a long moment. His expression shifted just slightly, just enough. Agreed, he said quietly. Daniel pushed the door open. Ethan looked up from his sums. He saw Daniel first, and his face did the small thing it had started doing over the past few days, a quick, involuntary relaxation. The face of someone who has learned that this particular person coming through the door means safety. Then, he saw the man behind Daniel, and his expression changed into something complicated and unreadable. Ethan, Daniel said, somebody's here to see you. Richard Miller crossed the room in 4 steps and went down on one knee in front of his nephew, and his composed, careful face broke open into something raw and unguarded. Hey, bud, he said. His voice cracked on the second word. Ethan stared at him. Uncle Richard, the boy said. It came out flat and careful with neither warmth nor coldness, just the measured tone of a child deciding what he felt. I came as soon as I could, Richard said. As soon as I saw the paper, He stopped. Started again. I'm sorry I didn't come sooner. I'm sorry I didn't know. Ethan looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Daniel, who was standing back near the counter, not interfering, just present. Then Ethan looked back at his uncle. My mama's in a hospital in Tucson, the boy said. I know. I'm going there tomorrow. I'm going to make sure she gets everything she needs. Ethan nodded slowly. She'll want to know I'm all right. I'll tell her. Tell her I have a room, Ethan said. Tell her I have food every day and someone sits with me at meals. A pause. Tell her the room smells like hay, but it's clean. She'll want to know it's clean. Richard Miller's eyes went bright, and he pressed his lips together hard. I'll tell her, he said. I'll tell her exactly that. Ethan studied him for another moment. Then he picked up his pencil and went back to his sums. It was not a dismissal. It was something more specific than that. It was a child who had learned to receive information carefully and process it privately, who had learned that his feelings were his own and not required to perform on demand for the adults around him. Richard stood up and turned and looked at Daniel, and his expression had changed again, less guarded this time. More honest. He trusts you. Richard said low enough that only Daniel could hear. We're getting to know each other, Daniel said. That's not what I mean. Richard glanced back at the boy. He checked on you before he answered me. He looked at you first. He paused. Do you know how long it takes a child like Ethan to look to someone like that? Daniel didn't answer. Richard reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. He set it on the counter between them. I have resources, he said. Considerable ones. I can give that boy surgeries, schooling, a house in Seattle with a room of his own, doctors who specialize in his condition. I can give him everything. He looked at Daniel steadily. What can you give him? The question hung in the air between them, direct and unanswerable, and genuinely meant not as cruelty, but as the honest accounting of a man who believed in practicalities. Daniel looked at the folded paper. He looked at Ethan, bent over his arithmetic at the back table, pencil moving with careful deliberation. He looked at Richard Miller. Today, he said, I gave him breakfast and somebody to look at when a stranger came through the door. He picked up his coffee cup. Yesterday, I gave him the same thing. Day before that, the same. He set the cup down. I reckon tomorrow I'll give him that too. Richard Miller looked at him for a long time. There's going to be a hearing, Richard said finally. The county is already involved. My lawyers will be there. This isn't going to be simple. No, Daniel agreed. I don't expect it will be. Richard picked up his valise. At the door he stopped and looked back at Ethan one more time, small and straight-backed, and working his sums with fierce concentration, and something in the man's face changed just briefly into something that looked almost like recognition. Then he walked out. Mamie came out of this kitchen untying her apron strings with the air of a woman who had heard every word and was choosing not to comment on most of it. She stood beside Daniel and looked at the door Richard Miller had just walked out of. "Lawyers," she said. "Lawyers," Daniel confirmed. "You got one of those?" Daniel looked at her. "Didn't think so," she said. She reached under the counter and pulled out a piece of paper and slid it across to him. "Tom Reardon. He handles cases out of Tucson. He owes me a very large favor from a very old debt, and I called it in this morning." She met Daniel's eyes. "Don't you dare tell me you don't need it." Daniel looked at the paper, then at Mamie, then back at the paper. "You did that this morning," he said. "Before the stage even came in. I did it the morning you walked in here with that boy," she said, and turned back toward the kitchen. At the back table, Ethan finished his sums, set his pencil down precisely parallel to the page, and looked up at Daniel. "Is Uncle Richard going to take me to Seattle?" he asked. Daniel walked over and sat down across from him. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at the boy straight on, the same way he had that first afternoon on the sidewalk. "There's going to be a hearing," he said. "A judge is going to decide what happens. You'll probably get to say what you want." Ethan absorbed this. "What do you want?" he asked. "I want what's right for you," Daniel said. "That's all I've ever wanted." Ethan looked at him with those dark, careful eyes. The same eyes that had been watching people walk past that broken hitching post for 4 days without blinking. The same eyes that had looked at Daniel, and for reasons a 5-year-old couldn't have articulated, but felt with absolute certainty, decided to trust him. "I know what I want," Ethan said quietly. Daniel waited, but Ethan just picked up his pencil, straightened his page, and started on the next sum. Whatever he wanted, he was keeping it for the moment it mattered most, and that moment was coming faster than any of them knew. Tom Reardon turned out to be a small man with a big voice and a suit that had seen better decades, and he arrived on the Monday stage with a battered leather satchel, a handshake like a vice, and the immediate unsettling impression that he had already read everything there was to read about Daniel Brooks, and was deciding how much of it was survivable. He came to Carver's stable and sat on an overturned bucket and looked at Daniel without any warm-up. "Tell me about the girl," he said. Daniel had known it was coming. He'd been knowing it was coming since the moment Cale Marsh said Pruitt had been talking. He sat down across from Reardon and told him about Clara, all of it straight through, without softening a single detail, and Reardon listened without his expression changing, and took notes in a small leather book with a pencil that needed sharpening. When Daniel finished, Reardon was quiet for a moment. "How many people in this county know?" he asked. "Enough," Daniel said. "Richard Miller's lawyers will use it." "I know." "They'll put it in front of the judge and frame you as a man who already killed one child through recklessness and is now seeking custody of another." Reardon tapped his pencil on the book. "That's the argument they'll make. It's a strong argument." "I know that too," Daniel said. Reardon looked at him for a long moment. "You could walk away from this," he said. "Let the uncle take him. By any objective measure, Richard Miller can give that boy more than you ever could." "I know," Daniel said for the 3rd time. "But you're not walking away." "No." Reardon clicked his tongue, put the pencil behind his ear. "Then here's what we need," he said, and he started talking, and Daniel listened, and somewhere across town in the back room of Mamie's diner, Ethan was doing arithmetic and waiting for the world to decide what to do with him. The hearing was set for Friday. Judge Caleb Whitmore came up from Tucson on the Thursday stage, a broad man with a white beard and the deliberate, unhurried manner of someone who had been making difficult decisions for 30 years and had made peace with the weight of them. He didn't speak to anyone the evening he arrived. He ate dinner alone at the hotel and retired early, and the town watched the hotel windows the way towns watch things they can't control. Richard Miller's lawyers were 2 men named Holt and Parrish, who wore matching gray suits and carried matching leather cases, and spoke with the smooth, efficient confidence of men who expected to win before the proceedings started. They had filed 3 documents with the court clerk by the time Daniel and Reardon arrived Friday morning, and Holt was already at the table arranging papers with the calm of a man laying out a trap. Daniel took his seat across the aisle. He looked straight ahead. The room was fuller than it needed to be. Harlan's Crossing didn't have a proper courthouse, so Judge Whitmore was using the town hall, and apparently the whole of Harlan's Crossing had decided that Friday morning's business could wait. Mamie was in the third row. Carver was beside her. Marshall Hicks stood near the back wall with his hat in his hands. Ben Pruitt was seated in the second row with the expression of a man who believed he was performing a civic duty. Ethan was not in the room. That had been Reardon's call. "The boy shouldn't have to sit through what's going to be said," he told Daniel the night before. "We'll bring him in when it's time." Daniel hadn't argued, but he'd looked toward the door twice already without meaning to. Judge Whitmore called the room to order, and Holt rose immediately, and what followed was the most efficiently brutal 12 minutes Daniel had ever sat through in his life. Holt laid it out without drama, which somehow made it worse. Richard Miller's financial records, his property, his professional standing, his connections to a surgeon in San Francisco who had already reviewed Ethan's case and believed the leg could be substantially corrected with 3 operations over 2 years. A letter from a physician. An enrollment offer from a school in Seattle that specialized in children with physical limitations. A full account of what Richard Miller could provide: medical, financial, educational, social, presented in clean, itemized detail, like a ledger of everything that was right and everything that was possible. Then Holt paused, turned a page. "With respect to Daniel Brooks," he said, and his voice shifted by exactly 1 degree, not louder, not sharper, just more precise. "The court should be made aware of the following." Daniel kept his eyes forward. Holt read the record: the drunk driving incident, Clara's name, Clara's age, the coroner's report, Daniel's conviction, the sentence served. The room went very quiet. Reardon put a hand flat on the table and didn't move. Holt set the page down. "The question before this court," he said, "is not whether Daniel Brooks is in some general sense a decent man. The question is whether a child with Ethan Miller's needs, medical, physical, financial, is best served by remaining in the care of a man who has already demonstrated under circumstances of his own making that a child in his care is not safe." He sat down. The room was so quiet that Daniel could hear the ceiling fan and the sound of his own breathing. Reardon stood up. He was a small man, and he did not have 2 matching suits or a leather case full of documents, and he spoke for exactly 4 minutes, and he said this: that the question before the court was not a balance sheet, but a child, and that a child was not a financial instrument, and that the measure of a man fit to raise a child was not his bank account, but his presence, and that there was one person in this room qualified to speak to Daniel Brooks's presence, and that person was 5 years old and waiting outside the door. "Your Honor," Reardon said, "I'd like to call Ethan Miller." Holt was on his feet before Reardon finished the sentence. "The boy is 5 years old. He cannot be considered a competent—" "He is the subject of this proceeding," Reardon said without raising his voice. "This court is deciding his future. With respect, if that boy cannot speak to his own future, then I don't know who can." Judge Whitmore looked at Holt, looked at Reardon, pulled his beard once. "I'll hear him," he said, informally, no oath, just a conversation. He looked at the door. "Bring him in." Daniel turned in his seat. Ethan came through the door on his crutch, wearing the clean shirt Daniel had bought him at the dry goods store 3 days ago, the same dry goods store owned by Ben Pruitt, a fact that had cost Daniel some private amusement. The boy moved slowly and steadily through the crowded room, and he didn't look at anyone except Daniel, just a quick, precise look that said, "I'm here, and I'm all right, and don't worry." And Daniel held the look for 1 second, before the boy moved past him to the front of the room. Judge Whitmore leaned forward in his chair and looked at Ethan the way a man looks at something that matters. "You know who I am," he said. "You're the judge," Ethan said. "You're going to decide where I live. That's right? Does that scare you?" Ethan considered the question seriously. "A little," he said. "But I know what I want to say." "Then say it," Whitmore said. "In your own time. Nobody's going to rush you." Ethan stood straight. His crutch was under his left arm. His right hand was at his side, and Daniel could see from where he sat that the boy's fingers were pressing tight against his leg, not visibly trembling, but working the way hands work when a person is holding very still on purpose. "My Uncle Richard is a good man," Ethan began. "He came a long way when he heard I needed help. He's going to help my mama get well." A pause. "He can give me surgeries in a school and a room with my own window." Another pause, smaller. "Those are good things." Holt wrote something on his paper. Ethan looked at the judge steadily. "But I want to stay with Daniel," he said. Whitmore waited. "Why?" he asked. And Ethan Miller, 5 years old, one leg twisted from birth, standing in a crowded town hall in Harlan's Crossing, Arizona Territory, on the hottest Friday morning in August, looked at the judge and said, "Because he waited." The room did not make a sound. "Everybody else looked at me and kept going," Ethan said. His voice was clear and careful, and entirely without drama, the way children tell the truth when nobody has taught them yet to decorate it. "I sat next to that hitching post for 4 days. People walked past me in the morning, and they walked past me in the afternoon, and they walked past me when it was so hot I couldn't think straight. Some of them looked at me and then looked away. Some of them didn't look at all." He paused. Daniel looked at me, and then he sat down. Whitmore said nothing. "He sat in the dirt in the middle of the street," Ethan continued, "and he waited while I ate. He didn't stand over me. He didn't hold the food out and wait for me to thank him. He sat down same as me, and he waited until I was done." The boy's fingers pressed harder against his leg. "Nobody ever did that before. Not once. Not the whole time I can remember." Somewhere in the third row, Mamie Coulthard made a sound that she covered immediately with her hand. "After," Ethan said, "when social services wanted to come and take me somewhere, I grabbed his sleeve." He looked at his own hand for a moment, then back at the judge. "I told him please don't let them put me outside again. And he didn't." A pause. "He didn't fight anybody. He didn't make any speeches. He just said, 'He stays with me.' And he said it like it was already decided." Whitmore had not moved. "My Uncle Richard can give me surgeries," Ethan said. "But Daniel gave me breakfast. He gave me breakfast yesterday and the day before and the day before that. He taught me that there would be food tomorrow. I didn't know that before." His voice was still level, still clear, still devastatingly plain. "He sits with me when I eat. He doesn't rush. He doesn't stand at the door. He sits down same as me, and he waits until I'm done." The room was absolutely still. Ethan looked at the judge. "Is that enough?" he said. "Or does it have to be something bigger?" Whitmore was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had changed not in volume, but in texture, like something rough had been sanded down to the grain. "No, son," he said. "That's enough." Daniel was not looking at anyone. He was looking at the floor directly in front of his boots, and his jaw was tight, and if his eyes were bright, it was nobody's business but his own. Holt rose from his seat. He was a professional, and his voice was controlled, but something in him had recalculated. "Your Honor," he said, "with all due respect to the child's sentiments, the court must weigh." "Mr. Holt." Whitmore's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. "I've been on this bench for 31 years. I've heard a great many compelling arguments." He looked at Ethan, then at Daniel, then back at Holt. "That boy just gave me the most compelling one I've ever heard. I suggest you let it sit for a moment." Holt sat down. Reardon had not moved or spoken since Ethan started talking. He sat perfectly still with his hands folded on the table, and the expression of a man who had just watched something happen that he hadn't entirely predicted. Whitmore looked at Richard Miller, who was sitting at the opposite table, with his hands clasped in front of him, and his jaw held very still. "Mr. Miller," the judge said, "you want to say anything?" Richard looked at his nephew for a long moment. Ethan looked back at him, without defiance and without apology, just the same careful measuring look that was the boy's particular way of being honest. "I want what's right for him," Richard said at last. His voice was quieter than it had been all morning. "I came here believing I knew what that was." He paused. "I'm not sure I was right." Whitmore nodded slowly. Then something happened that no one in that room had predicted. Ben Pruitt stood up. Not at the table, not at any official position. Just stood up from his seat in the second row, the way a man does when he can't help it, when something inside him has been building pressure and finally finds its way out, despite his better judgment. "Your Honor," Pruitt said, "the court should know that this man Brooks has a history of—" "Mr. Pruitt." Whitmore's voice cut through the room like a clean blade. "Sit down." Pruitt sat. "This is not a public meeting," Whitmore said. "The history of Daniel Brooks has been entered into the record by counsel and will be considered in my deliberation. You are a private citizen who has inserted yourself into a legal proceeding, and I will ask you once, only once, to keep your seat and your opinions to yourself." Pruitt's face went red. He kept his seat, and in the brief charged silence that followed, Daniel looked up from the floor for the first time since Ethan had started speaking, and he looked at the boy who was still standing at the front of the room with his crutch and his clean shirt and his fingers pressed against his leg, and Ethan looked back at him, and something passed between them that didn't need words and wouldn't have been improved by them. Reardon leaned close to Daniel's ear. "He just changed everything," he said very low. "I know," Daniel said. "Whitmore's going to rule today, before end of session." "I know." Reardon sat back. He pulled at the worn edge of his sleeve in a habitual gesture Daniel had already come to recognize as the man's version of composure. "I've been doing this 20 years, Reardon said, just for Daniel still low. "I've had clients lie to me, charm juries cry on cue, bring their whole extended families to court in their Sunday best." He paused. "I never had a 5-year-old walk in and do what that boy just did." Daniel kept his eyes on Ethan, who had been guided back to a seat near the front and was sitting very straight, very still, doing the thing he did, holding himself together by force of intention. "He learned it the hard way," Daniel said. "What's that?" "That you only get one chance to say the true thing," Daniel said. "And you better say it plain because nobody's going to say it for you." Reardon looked at him, looked at Ethan, looked back at Daniel. And for the first time since they'd met 4 days ago, he had nothing to add. Judge Whitmore returned from his deliberation in 45 minutes. The room had not emptied. People had shifted in their seats, spoken in low voices, gone to get water, and come back. Mamie had not moved. Hicks had not moved. Ben Pruitt had not moved, though he'd clearly wanted to, and Richard Miller had sat at his table with his lawyers on either side of him and stared at nothing with the expression of a man privately reorganizing something that had come loose. When Whitmore came back in the room, snapped to silence, he sat. He put his papers in front of him. He looked out at the room with the deliberate, settled authority of a man who had made his decision and was at peace with it. In the matter of Ethan Miller, he said, "This court finds as follows." Daniel put both hands flat on the table in front of him, the same way he had held himself still 1,000 times when holding still was the only thing left. Whitmore looked at him over the papers. "Temporary custody," he said, "is granted to Daniel Brooks." The room broke open. The noise in the room lasted exactly 4 seconds before Judge Whitmore's gavel came down twice hard and the room went quiet again. But those 4 seconds told Daniel everything he needed to know about Harlan's Crossing. Half the room exhaled like they'd been holding their breath for an hour. Mamie made a sound that was not quite a word. Carver at her elbow put his hat on and took it off again. Marshal Hicks unfolded his arms, and Ben Pruitt pressed his lips into a flat, bloodless line and stared at the floor the way a man stares when he has lost something he decided was his before the contest even started. Richard Miller's lawyers were already leaning in toward him, speaking low and fast. Richard didn't move. He was looking at Ethan, and Ethan was looking at Daniel, and Daniel was looking at the table in front of him, because if he looked up right now, he was not entirely sure what his face would do, and he had held himself together in that room for 2 hours, and he intended to keep doing it until he was somewhere private. Whitmore wasn't finished. "Temporary custody to Daniel Brooks," the judge repeated into the restored quiet, "pending the following conditions." He looked at his papers. "Mr. Brooks will maintain stable housing for the child. Mr. Brooks will ensure the child receives appropriate medical evaluation within 30 days. This court will review the arrangement in 6 months, at which time all parties may present updated circumstances." He looked up. "Mr. Miller?" Richard turned from looking at his nephew. "Your resources have been noted," Whitmore said. "The court encourages you to remain involved in this child's life, in whatever capacity serves his well-being. That is not a ruling. That is a suggestion from an old man who has watched too many families break apart over who wins, and not enough think about what winning is actually for." He closed his papers. "We're adjourned." The gavel came down one more time. Holt was on his feet, immediately speaking to Richard in a low, rapid voice. Daniel caught the word appeal, and then Reardon's hand was on his shoulder. "Don't look at them," Reardon said quietly. "Go get your boy." Daniel stood up. Crossed the aisle. Ethan was still sitting in his chair near the front, very straight crutch across his knees, waiting. The way he always waited, not anxious, not impatient. Just present, conserving himself for whatever came next. He looked up when Daniel reached him. "We won," the boy said. "We won," Daniel said. Ethan nodded once. Then he said, "My leg hurts from standing so long." "Let's get you out of here," Daniel said, and held out his hand, and Ethan took it and got himself upright, and they walked out of the Harlan's Crossing town hall together into the August morning, and the door swung shut behind them, and that was that. Richard Miller caught up with them before they reached the end of the street. He came alone, no lawyers, no valise, no careful managed expression. He looked like a man who had set something down that he'd been carrying for a long time, and wasn't entirely sure how to stand without the weight of it. "Brooks," he said. Daniel stopped. Ethan stopped beside him. Richard looked at his nephew first. "I'm not going to fight this," he said. It was said directly to the boy, not to Daniel, which was the right instinct. "I want you to know that. I'm not going to make this harder than it needs to be." Ethan studied him. "Okay," he said carefully. "I'm going to Tucson tomorrow to see your mother," Richard continued. "I'm going to make sure she has everything she needs to get well, and I'm going to come back." He paused. "If that's all right with you." Ethan looked at Daniel. Daniel said nothing. This was not his call to make, and he knew it. Ethan looked back at his uncle. "You can come back," he said. "You can have dinner with us." A pause. "Mamie makes good cornbread." Something in Richard Miller's face moved like a fault line shifting. He pressed his mouth together briefly. "I'd like that," he said. Then he looked at Daniel. And the look between them was the look of two men who had been on opposite sides of a table and were now somehow on the same side of a problem, and neither of them was entirely sure how to navigate that, but both of them were willing to try. "The surgeries," Richard said. "The San Francisco physician. I want to fund that, regardless of anything else." He held Daniel's eyes. "That's not negotiation. That's not me trying to—" He stopped, started again. "That boy's leg can be fixed, and I have the money to fix it. Let me do that much." Daniel looked at him for a moment. He thought about pride, which he had always had too much of, and he thought about Ethan's twisted leg, and the way the boy dragged it through the dirt, and had never once complained about it in Daniel's hearing. "That's Ethan's call," Daniel said. "Not mine." They both looked at the boy. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Will it hurt?" he asked. Some, Richard said honestly. "The doctor said the recovery is hard, but he said you'd walk better. A lot better. Maybe—" He paused. "He said maybe you'd walk without the crutch." Ethan looked at the crutch under his arm. He'd had it, or versions of it, for as long as he could remember. He looked at it the way people look at things that have been both limitation and lifeline and are not sure how to feel about the possibility of their absence. "Okay," he said finally. "Tell him okay." Richard Miller reached out and put his hand briefly on the boy's shoulder, not grabbing, not pulling, just a brief, honest contact. "Thank you," he said, "for what you said in there. You didn't have to be that fair to me." Ethan looked up at him with those level, serious eyes. "You came," the boy said simply. "When you saw the paper, you came. That matters." Richard nodded. His throat moved. He didn't say anything else. He tipped his hat at Daniel, picked up his valise from where he'd set it on the boardwalk, and walked back toward the hotel. And Daniel watched him go, and something in his chest that had been clenched tight all morning loosened by one careful degree. The weeks that followed were not easy, and Daniel did not pretend they were. Living with a child was a different kind of work than any he had done before. Not harder exactly, but more present. It demanded his attention in ways that roadwork didn't roadwork, just demanded his body, and he had always had enough body to give. This demanded that he be awake and paying attention at 6 in the morning, when Ethan's nightmares woke him, and at noon, when the boy needed to eat on a schedule, and at dusk when Ethan got quiet in a particular way that meant something was sitting heavy on him and needed drawing out with the right kind of patience. The nightmares were the worst of the early weeks. The first time it happened, 3 days after the hearing, Daniel heard Ethan cry out in the dark and was across the room before he was fully awake, and he found the boy sitting bolt upright on the cot, with his eyes open and his face blank in the way of someone still half inside a dream. "Ethan," Daniel said low and even. "You're here. You're in the room. You're safe." Ethan blinked, focused. His breathing was fast and shallow. "Was it the bridge?" Daniel asked. The boy shook his head. "The street," he said. "The hitching post." A pause. "I keep dreaming I'm still there and nobody comes." Daniel sat on the edge of the cot. Not crowding, just close. "But somebody came," he said. "I know." Ethan pulled his knees to his chest. "In the dream? I don't know yet." "You want me to stay till you fall back?" Ethan looked at him sideways, the careful, self-contained look of a child who had learned that needing things made people leave. "You don't have to," he said. "I know I don't have to," Daniel said. He sat back against the wall, feet on the floor, arms crossed over his chest, in the way of a man settling in for however long was required. "Go back to sleep, Ethan." Ethan lay back down slowly. The breathing evened out. It took 20 minutes, and Daniel sat there for all of it. And sometime in the third week, the nightmares started coming less often. And by the end of the month, they were down to twice a week, and Ethan started sleeping longer in the mornings. And something in his face changed, a loosening around the eyes, a softening at the jaw. The specific physical expression of a body that has decided at a cellular level that the emergency is over. Daniel noticed the morning Ethan laughed for the first time. It was a small thing. Carver's old tabby cat had stolen a piece of cornbread off the table and was sitting on the windowsill eating it, with the absolute, unashamed satisfaction of a creature that recognizes no authority but its own. And Ethan had looked at it, and then at Daniel, and then back at the cat. And the laugh that came out of him was surprised and genuine, and entirely unguarded, the laugh of a child who has forgotten for one moment to be careful. Daniel turned away toward the stove before Ethan could see his face. It was around this time that Mamie started giving him cooking lessons. She did it without announcing it as a lesson, which was the only reason Daniel tolerated it. She would simply appear at the stable room in the early evening with 2 or 3 things from her kitchen, and talk through what she was doing while she did it, and Daniel would watch and occasionally help, and Ethan would sit at the table and offer opinions that were sometimes useful and often very funny and always entirely sincere. "You're burning the onions," Ethan said one evening. "I know I'm burning the onions," Daniel said. "Mamie says you burn them on purpose because you don't have the patience to go slow." "Mamie talks too much." Ethan looked at Mamie, who was standing in the doorway with her arms folded and an expression of complete vindication. "He says you talk too much," Ethan reported. "I heard him," Mamie said. "She doesn't seem offended," Ethan observed. "I'm never offended by accurate information," Mamie said, and came in and moved Daniel aside and fixed the onions. These were the small moments, and Daniel collected them without meaning to. The way a man in the desert collects water not from any plan, just from the deep, involuntary recognition of what keeps a person alive. Tom Reardon came by in the 5th week with papers for Daniel to sign routine follow-up documentation for the court. Nothing alarming, and he sat at the table and watched Ethan do his schoolwork for a few minutes before he said quietly to Daniel, "How's he doing?" "Better every day," Daniel said. "And you?" Daniel looked at him. "You're different," Reardon said plainly, "than when I met you." Daniel was quiet for a moment. He looked at the boy bent over his page with that particular focused frown he got when the arithmetic was giving him trouble. "He saved me," Daniel said finally, low enough that only Reardon heard it. "I know that sounds backward, but he did." Reardon looked at him steadily. "It doesn't sound backward," he said. "It sounds exactly right." It was on a Wednesday in September that Richard Miller came back as he'd said he would. He arrived on the afternoon stage with a leather satchel and a letter from the San Francisco physician confirming Ethan's first surgical consultation was scheduled for the spring, and he sat down at Mamie's corner table and ate cornbread and talked to his nephew for 2 hours, while Daniel sat 3 tables away and pretended to read the newspaper. He wasn't reading the newspaper, he was listening. What he heard was Richard Miller talking to Ethan about his mother carefully, honestly, without false reassurance, and without unnecessary darkness. Margaret was improving. The heat stroke had been severe, but the Tucson physicians were confident. She was talking more. She'd asked about Ethan every single day. "Does she know I'm okay?" Ethan asked. "She knows," Richard said. "I told her everything. About Daniel, about Mamie, about the stable and the horses and the cat that steals bread." Ethan smiled at that. "Did she laugh about the cat?" "She did," Richard said. "First time she laughed in 3 weeks." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Does she know about the hearing?" "She knows." "What did she say?" Richard was quiet for a moment. "She said—" He paused and his voice shifted. "She said she was glad you found someone who knew how to wait." The table went silent. Daniel set the newspaper down very carefully on the table in front of him. Ethan was looking at his hands. "She said that, word for word," Richard said. "I wrote it down so I'd get it right." Ethan looked up at the ceiling for a moment in the way people do when they are trying to keep something from escaping their face. His jaw worked once. Then he picked up his fork and went back to his cornbread because he was Ethan Miller. And this was how he processed things, and Daniel understood that now, the way he understood the nightmares, and the careful eating, and the sideways looks as the language of a child who had learned to absorb everything quietly because no one had ever made space for him to be loud. Daniel stood up from his table. He walked over and stood at the edge of Ethan and Richard's table. Both of them looked at him. "Richard," he said, "stay for supper if you want. I'm cooking." Richard glanced at Ethan. "He burns the onions on purpose," Ethan said. "But it's still good." Richard Miller looked at Daniel Brooks across the table, and something in the look was an acknowledgement, not an apology, not a concession, but the honest recognition of one man for another in a situation neither of them had chosen, and both of them were choosing to show up for. "I'll stay," Richard said. They ate supper together in the room above Carver's stable, the 3 of them at the small table, with the lamp lit, and the window open to the first real cool air of September. And Mamie had appeared at some point, as she always seemed to, with a pot of something better than what Daniel had been making, and Carver's tabby had come up the outside stairs and positioned itself hopefully near Ethan's chair, and Ethan had fed it exactly 1 piece of bread and told it firmly that was all it was getting, and the cat had accepted this ruling and gone to sleep under the table. Richard Miller left on the morning stage. Before he went, he stopped Daniel at the stable door. "She's going to come back," Richard said. "Margaret, when she's well enough." He looked at Daniel carefully. "What happens then?" Daniel thought about it honestly. "I don't know," he said. "But whatever happens, it'll be about what's right for Ethan. Same as it's always been." Richard nodded slowly. He pulled on his gloves. "You know," he said, "when I came off that stage 6 weeks ago, I thought I already knew the answer to this. I thought I knew exactly what that boy needed and exactly what kind of man you were and exactly how this was going to go." Daniel waited. "I was wrong on all 3, Richard said. He picked up his valise. "I just wanted you to know I know that." He walked to the stage without looking back. Daniel stood at the stable door and watched it pull out, and then he went upstairs, and Ethan was already at the table, with his schoolwork pencil in hand, frowning at his arithmetic with the focused intensity of a boy who had decided that learning things was something he was going to do seriously now that he had the space and safety to do it. "He gone?" Ethan asked without looking up. "He's gone," Daniel said. "He's coming back, though." "He is." Ethan made a small sound of satisfaction and turned the page. "Good," he said. "I think he's trying." Daniel sat down across from him and picked up the newspaper he'd abandoned the night before. "I think so too," he said. They sat together in the comfortable quiet of a room that had become, in the space of 6 weeks, something neither of them had had in longer than they could clearly remember: a home. Daniel was reading about the fall cattle prices, and Ethan was frowning at long division when the sound of boots on the outside stairs made them both look up. It was Marshal Hicks. He stopped in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and he looked at Daniel, and the look on his face said everything, before his mouth opened, and Daniel set the newspaper down very slowly. "Daniel," Hicks said, "I just got a wire from Tucson." Ethan had gone completely still. Hicks looked at the boy, then at Daniel. He took a breath. "Margaret Miller," he said, "discharged herself from the hospital this morning." The room held absolutely still. "They don't know where she went," Hicks said. Ethan did not move. He sat at the table with his pencil in his hand and his arithmetic page in front of him, and he did not move a single muscle. And Daniel watched the boy's face do something complicated and controlled, and entirely private, the way Ethan's face always did when he was deciding what to feel before he felt it out loud. "Discharged herself," Ethan said finally. His voice was level, carefully level. "That's what the wire says," Hicks confirmed. He was still in the doorway, hat in his hands. "This morning early. She told the nurses she was fine, and she signed the paper, and she left." "She's not fine," Ethan said. "She's been in that bed for 2 months." "I know, son. She does things like that," Ethan said. And there was something in the words that was not anger and not quite grief, but somewhere in the territory between them, the exhausted, complicated love of a child who knows his mother's patterns the way he knows his own heartbeat. When she thinks she's being a burden, she leaves. She always thinks she's being a burden. Daniel set his newspaper on the table very deliberately. He looked at Hicks. "How long ago?" "Wire came in an hour back. She left around 6 this morning." Daniel did the math. "She's been walking for hours," he said. "In the condition she's in." He stood up. "Hicks." "Already sent 2 men toward the Tucson road," Hicks said. "I came here first because I figured—" He glanced at Ethan. "I figured you'd want to know before anyone else did." "I appreciate it," Daniel said. Hicks put his hat on and left. The room went quiet. Outside, a horse moved in its stall. Somewhere below, Carver dropped something metal and swore. Ethan put his pencil down parallel to his page. His hands were perfectly still. "She's walking to Harlan's Crossing," he said. "That's where she'll come." "She doesn't know where you are specifically," Daniel said carefully. "She knows I'm here," Ethan said. He looked up, and his eyes were bright and absolutely dry, the eyes of a child who had cried all his tears in private a long time ago, and had nothing left but the steady, fierce certainty of someone who knows his own mother. "She'll come to the main street first. She always comes to where the people are." Daniel looked at him for a long moment. "Then we'll be on the main street," he said. They were there within 10 minutes, Daniel and Ethan on the boardwalk outside Mamie's. Ethan on his crutch. Daniel with his hands in his pockets, neither of them speaking. Mamie came out with 2 cups of coffee and set one on the rail for Daniel, and looked at Ethan and went back inside without a word, which was the most respectful thing she could have done. They waited for 40 minutes. Ethan stood the whole time. Didn't ask for a chair. Didn't shift or fidget or complain about his leg. just stood on the boardwalk and watched the end of the main street where the Tucson road came in with the particular focused patience of a boy who had learned to wait for things that mattered. It was Daniel who saw her first. She was on foot as Ethan had said she would be. She was thinner than she should have been, thinner than was safe, and she was moving slowly, and she had a hand pressed to her ribs in the unconscious way of someone whose body is telling them to stop and who has decided not to listen. She was wearing a hospital dress under a coat that didn't fit, and her dark hair was loose, and she had Ethan's same eyes, the same shape, the same measuring quality. And they were fixed on the main street ahead of her, with the single-minded intensity of a woman who had decided to do one thing and was going to do it if it killed her. It might have, Daniel thought. Another few miles, and it might have. "There," he said quietly. Ethan turned. He saw her. His whole body went rigid for 1 second, one sharp involuntary second, and then he stepped off the boardwalk and moved toward her on his crutch faster than Daniel had ever seen him move. Not running, because running was beyond him, but closed the crutch hitting the dirt in a rapid, urgent rhythm. "Mama." Margaret Miller heard her son's voice and stopped walking. She stood in the middle of the street and looked at him coming toward her, and her hand dropped from her ribs, and her face did something that had no name. Not relief, not guilt, not joy, not grief. But all of them at once, layered on top of each other, like colors that make something new when they mix. Ethan reached her, and she went to her knees in the dirt in front of him, and put both hands on his face and looked at him. Just looked at him, checking him. The way mothers check their children after something terrible, counting the parts, confirming the wholeness, making sure everything is still there. "You're all right," she said. It was barely a sound. "I'm all right," Ethan said. His voice was thick. "Mama, I told you I'd be all right. I know." Her thumbs moved across his cheeks. "I know you did." "You walked from Tucson," he said. "Part of the way," she said. "A wagon gave me a ride for the last bit." "You're supposed to still be in the hospital." "I'm supposed to be with my son," she said simply, and that ended the argument. Daniel had walked up behind Ethan and stopped at a respectful distance, and when Margaret Miller looked up and saw him, he took off his hat. She stayed on her knees in the dirt in the middle of the street and looked at him, and the look went on long enough to say several things that didn't have words yet. "You're Daniel Brooks," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at her son, at the clean shirt, at the weight in his face that wasn't there before. Not burden, but substance, the specific solidity of a child who has been fed and kept and known consistently for long enough that it has changed his bones. She looked at all of that, and she looked back at Daniel, and she said, "Thank you," with a plainness and a fullness that was the most complete thank you he had ever received in his life. "He's a good boy," Daniel said. "I know what he is," she said softly. "I need help getting up." Daniel stepped forward and gave her his hand, and she stood slowly with the careful movements of someone whose body was running on willpower and not much else. "You need to sit down," Daniel said. "I need to see my son," she said. "You can do both," he said, and walked them both to Mamie's. What followed was not simple, and nobody pretended it was. Margaret was not well, not close to well. The heat stroke had done real damage, and the walk, however partial, had cost her. Mamie took one look at her and put her in the back room on the cot that had become Ethan's second nap spot, and there was a brief, fierce argument in which Margaret insisted she was fine, and Mamie informed her with complete calm that she was not in fact the authority on that, and Margaret, who was exhausted down to the marrow, lost the argument inside of 4 minutes. Ethan sat beside the cot and held his mother's hand, and they talked in low voices for a long time, and Daniel stayed in the front room of the diner and drank 3 cups of coffee and let them have it. When Ethan came out, his eyes were red at the edges. He sat down across from Daniel without speaking for a moment. Then he said, "She knows she can't take care of me right now." "Okay," Daniel said. "She knows she needs to get better first." Ethan looked at his hands. She said she spent so long trying to survive that she forgot to teach me how to live." His jaw worked. She said you did that instead. Daniel didn't say anything. She's not going away, Ethan said. His voice had a warning edge in it, not to Daniel, just to the universe in general, the fierce preventive assertion of a child who has had too many people go away. She's staying in Harlan's Crossing. She's going to get well here. That sounds right, Daniel said. And I'm still staying with you. Ethan looked up. She said that too. She said it's what's right for now, and she's not too proud to know it. Daniel looked at the boy across the table and thought about that Thursday stage arriving 2 months ago, and a man in a gray suit striding down the main street with a valise and absolute certainty. And he thought about Tom Reardon on a 3-legged bucket asking about Clara. And he thought about the 4 days Ethan had spent next to a broken hitching post while the whole town of Harlan's Crossing walked past. He thought about how a single moment of staying had unraveled into all of this. Ethan, he said. The boy looked at him. She's right, Daniel said, about you learning to live. You walked into Mamie's that first day, and you ate like you were afraid the food would disappear. You saved biscuits for tomorrow because you didn't believe there would be food. You woke up screaming because, in your dream, nobody came. He paused. You don't do those things anymore. Ethan was very still. That happened because you let somebody stay, Daniel said. You let me sit down. You didn't push me off. You could have, a lot of kids would have after 4 days of nothing. But you let me sit down, and you ate that biscuit, and you said okay, and that was the bravest thing I've ever seen anybody do. Ethan looked at him for a long moment. His chin moved once just slightly. You stayed, the boy said. That's what you did. You stayed. I stayed, Daniel confirmed. And I'm going to keep staying. That's not changing. Ethan nodded. Once sharp, precise, his particular way of receiving things that mattered too much for casual response. Then he stood up and went back into the room to sit with his mother, and Daniel put both hands around his coffee cup and held it until the heat stopped being comfortable. Margaret Miller was not easy to know. She was proud in the way that people who have survived on nothing but pride often are not arrogant, but careful, fiercely self-sufficient, in ways that made accepting help feel like a small death every time. She and Daniel developed an understanding that took 2 weeks to settle, and several direct uncomfortable conversations to get there. And it was not graceful, and it was not warm at first, but it was honest. She came to him one evening when Ethan was asleep, and she sat down across from him in the stable room and said, I need to know who you are. Ask what you want to ask, Daniel said. The girl, she said. Clara, I know about it. I figured you would. Were you drinking when you put her on that horse? Daniel looked at her. Yes. Margaret held his eyes. You haven't had a drink since. Since the morning of her funeral, he said. No. Why should I believe that? You shouldn't, he said. Not on my word. Watch and decide. She watched for another 3 weeks, and then she stopped asking. It was Richard Miller who brokered the arrangement that actually worked. Richard, who returned from Seattle in October, with the surgeon's preliminary schedule and the quiet, practical energy of a man who had decided that showing up was more important than being right. He set up a small fund with Mamie as co-signatory for Margaret's medical costs for the room she took above the laundry for the slow incremental rebuilding of a life that had come apart over years of hard luck and the specific kind of poverty that good intentions alone can't fix. Margaret took the help. It cost her, and everyone could see it cost her, and nobody mentioned it, and that was the kindest thing they could have done. By November, she was working 3 mornings a week at Mamie's, washing up some cooking, whatever needed doing. By December, she was up to 5 days. Her hands steadied. Her color came back. She ate regularly for the first time in longer than she could remember, and the weight of it, the simple physical restoration of being fed, consistently changed something in her face that she hadn't even known was gone. She and Ethan had dinner together twice a week, sometimes at Mamie's, sometimes in Daniel's room, above the stable, where the 3 of them sat at the small table, and the cat positioned itself near Ethan's chair, and was told exactly once that it was getting 1 piece of bread and no more, and accepted this verdict with royal indifference. It was not the family any of them had imagined. It was the family that had grown from one decision made on a July afternoon, by a road crew worker with 35 cents and one biscuit who had looked at a small boy sitting alone in the dirt and turned around. Ethan's first surgery was in the spring. The San Francisco physician came to Tucson to do it. Richard had made the arrangements quietly and without fanfare, and Daniel and Margaret both made the trip sitting on opposite sides of the waiting room for 4 hours without speaking much, and Mamie had pressed food into both their hands before they left and told them not to be idiots about eating it on the way, and they had obeyed. When the physician came out and said the surgery had gone well, and that the boy would need 2 months of careful recovery before the next stage, Daniel and Margaret looked at each other across the waiting room, and what passed between them was not warmth exactly, but something in the vicinity, the mutual recognition of two people who love the same child and have decided against the odds of their situation to be adequate to that fact. Margaret said, "He's going to walk better." "He's going to walk better," Daniel confirmed. She looked at her hands for a moment. Then she said quietly, "I spent years telling myself I was doing the best I could. And I was. I was doing the best I could with what I had." She paused. "But I had nothing, and I knew it, and I kept telling myself things would turn." She looked up. "They didn't turn. You turned them." "You would have found a way," Daniel said. "Don't do that," she said. "Not sharp, just direct. Don't make it easier for me than it was. He sat next to that hitching post for 4 days. 4 days, and I couldn't stop it." Her voice didn't break. It just went very quiet. "Let me carry that. I need to carry it so I don't do it again." Daniel looked at her. "All right," he said. "Thank you," she said, for the second time, with the same plainness and the same fullness. They brought Ethan home. 1 year later, on a Saturday in July, the anniversary of the afternoon, Daniel had turned around on the main street of Harlan's Crossing. They went back to the hitching post. All of them. Daniel and Ethan and Margaret and Mamie, who had decided to close the diner for 2 hours and had not asked anyone's opinion about it. Richard Miller had come down from Seattle the day before on business that may or may not have been as urgent as he claimed, and he was there too, a little back from the group with his hat in his hands. They carried cloth-wrapped parcels, cornbread biscuits, canteens of cold water. Things that kept. Things that mattered. There were 2 families sheltering near the old trestle bridge, a woman with 3 small children and an elderly man who had been walking since before sunrise and whose boots had given out somewhere around the county line. They sat in whatever shade they could find with the particular stillness of people who had run out of options and were waiting to see what happened next. Ethan walked to them on his crutch, steadier than a year ago, stronger, the surgeon's work showing in the way the bad leg tracked differently, less drag, less compensation, and he crouched down in front of the nearest child, a girl of about 4, with dust on her face, and the wary, measuring eyes of a child who has learned to be careful. He held out a piece of cornbread. The girl looked at it, looked at him, looked at it again. "Take your time," Ethan said quietly. "Ain't going anywhere." He said it the same way Daniel had said it to him 1 year ago in the dirt by the hitching post. The same words, the same tone. Not performed, just passed forward the way things that are true get passed from one person to the next when someone takes the time to teach them. The girl took the cornbread. Daniel stood back and watched. He watched Ethan sit down in the dirt beside the girl while she ate cross-legged, unhurried, fully present. He watched Margaret crouch beside the woman with the 3 children and speak to her in a voice too low to carry the voice of someone who knows from the inside what that particular exhaustion feels like. He watched Mamie hand the old man with the worn-out boots a full canteen and sit down on a rock next to him, like she had nowhere else in the world to be. He watched Richard Miller, who had started this summer in a gray suit with a leather valise and total certainty, stand quietly at the edge of things and hand out biscuits with the careful, deliberate attention of a man learning late what it means to just be present. And Daniel Brooks, who had been broken and rebuilt by guilt for 6 years, who had turned around on a hot July afternoon because a child's silence was louder than everything else on the street, who had given away his last biscuit and his last 35 cents, and his room above a stable, and his whole private, careful life. Daniel Brooks understood finally, completely, without question, what had happened to him. He had not saved a boy. A boy had shown him how to stop walking past the thing that mattered. And everyone standing in that dry Arizona morning, passing food to strangers in the dirt, Margaret still healing. Richard still learning. Mamie, who had never stopped. Ethan, who had begun every single one of them, was there because one man had chosen once in one ordinary moment to turn around. That was all it had taken. That was all it ever takes. One person who stops. One hand that holds out bread without calculating the cost. One pair of eyes that looks at another human being and says, without flinching, "You are worth stopping for," and means it and stays and does not leave until the eating is done, and the other person has had the chance to feel maybe for the first time that the world has room enough for them in it. Ethan looked back over his shoulder at Daniel and held his gaze for one steady, certain moment. Daniel tipped his hat, and Ethan turned back to the girl in the dirt and waited patient and unhurried while she finished every last crumb.
No, that's so true. Absolutely true, honestly. Yeah, no, for sure. So like I don't have I just need to make a pros and cons list, honestly. And for folks that don't know, I'm currently not on I'm not on some medicine that is, well, it's partly an anxiety medication, and I'm not on it this past week because I was my prescription had not been, they had not sent in a new prescription. Oh my god,
Alert.
Danny,
Vessel approaching.
what the heck?
The vessel is hailing.
Oh my god, hello friend, hello. Oh my god, hi, love your face. Welcome in, Dare. Welcome in, Gizzard. Oh my gosh, I love the Gizzard Gary. That's amazing. Hello. What the heck?
One message from Starfleet coming in on secured channel.
Oh my god. Thank you so much. Oh, Storm's girl. Thank you for the follow. Together. Hello. Welcome in. Hello, attorney from below. Welcome in. Hello, inappropriate toast appeal. Oh my god, I love these names. Attorney from below. Welcome in, Vili Mars. Blood Rain 420. Hello, Jazz. Welcome in, Uncle Jimbo. Hello, hello, Maker. Mark. Oh my gosh, I always sometimes call you Maker still. Hello, Mark. Hello, Danny. How you doing? Welcome in. Thank you so much for the biddies. Thanks for starting a hype train, y'all. Gizzard Gary, Danny, inappropriate toast appeal, Uncle Jimbo. Thank you so much for the biddies. Hello, oh yeah. Mia, or is it Mian? I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Hello, Alf. Hello. Hello. Hello, AJ. Nivix. Oh my gosh. Vili, thank you for the biddies as well. Raven, love your face. How you doing?